I have no smart way to start this video, I just think the Ultramarines are better than everyone else. The lore supports it, GW supports it, look at all the countless evidence for it. Cato Sicaria stunting on Catan, Gilman being the first Primarch to return, and even before that, having the most worlds brought into compliance during the Great Crusade. I'm sorry fans of every other Space Marine chapter, but there can only be one that's the greatest of them all, and that's the Ultramarines. I mean, they get video game characters turned into models that have entire cinematic trailers to announce the second model. Shout out Chiron, by the way, I wish Gadriel died instead of you. But as with all great people, they need a support network to ensure they can remain great. No army can subsist without a nation behind its back, with the exception of Genghis Khan and the Mongols, who carried their nation alongside them. Luckily for the Ultramarines, they have not only the Imperium backing them up, but the realm of Ultramar. A land where things are at least a 6 out of 10, which in the world of Warhammer 40,000 might as well be a 600 out of 10. People have food, the Ultramarines and numerous other chapters defend them from threats, and they're having an overall great time being the Byzantines to the Imperium at large's Rome. So today, let's take a look at the greatest realm of them all, for even in the grim darkness of the far future, there are still some places that only suck a little bit. But before I begin, do you happen to have the time? You don't? Well, what if I had just the thing to help you with that? Because I do. Holzkern, the sponsor of this video. Holzkern makes nothing less than the finest watches, jewelry, and bandlets to ever be seen on the planet, the perfect sort of gift for this holiday season. Made out of premium and all natural materials, they're not only quality, but you can find anything to suit your taste. And I don't just mean there's a few different shades of color, I mean that if you want, you can get a watch made out of wood and leaves. I didn't know that was physically possible, but Holzkern has proved me wrong in the most elegant way possible. Marble, silver, lapis lazuli, those are just some of the options you have to get yourself a premium watch. And of course, that's not all. Plenty of jewelry options await you, be that as a gift for a special someone or just to get yourself something nice for Christmas. Earrings, rings, necklaces. If you want something to spice up your outfit or show someone you appreciate them, you can do no better. Plus, jewelry comes in a green gift box and the watches in a red gift pouch if you would like them to be. All the trouble of wrapping your gift can be done for you. And if you order by December 19th, you'll get what you want just in time for Christmas. There's no need to worry about holiday shipping ruining your schedule. International shipping won't get in the way of your perfect Christmas gift. They also offer free express shipping with products typically arriving in 3 to 5 business days, plus US custom fees taken care of if you live there. And just as a Christmas present from me to you, if you click my link below and use code Pancreas at checkout, you can grab yourself a 15% discount on your purchase. That's the link in the description and pinned comment and code Pancreas at checkout for a 15% discount on your purchase. For premium watches, jewelry, and more, and a premium gift, you can do no better than Holzkern, so head on over to get something special today. Now then, time to accept that everything the Ultramarines touch is better off for it. Ultramar's history predates that of even the Imperium itself, making the homeland of the Smurfs one of the oldest remaining human polities in the setting. As with a large amount of Imperial worlds, it was a human colony during the Age of Strife, but unlike others, it was able to weather the time period with relatively minimal issue. I'm not going to make the claim that they made it through with no issues, basically no one did, but compared to the rest of humanity, things were alright. These worlds survived largely unharmed with their industry intact and ready to keep them safe, and between some very short-range craft, which remind me of Tau FTL, and sublight ships, the planets of Ultramar were able to remain in contact with each other. Combine this with the fact that the system the capital world is in, Macragge, contains several other planets as well, and what would become Ultramar had quite the stable foundations to weather the storm with. Just the fact it knew it wasn't completely alone likely helped things go smoothly. Knowing others were out there nearby probably helped assuage fears that humanity beyond them wasn't extinct, which is the kind of thing I imagine would cause massive riots at the very least as people panicked. For the general history, I'll make some broad summaries before getting into individual stuff. It'll flow better in my brain that way. The system continued marching forward despite the Age of Strife, turning into Space Rome eventually, and the next big upheaval in Ultramar's history was of course the arrival of Rabute Guilliman, Primarch and future leader of the Imperium once he hit modern times. As much as any one person, even a demigod, can claim to lead the Imperium, that is. When he arrived and took power, he turned the capital world of Macragge into a meritocratic paradise his dad always wanted. No, not the Emperor, his adoptive father, who was an actual dad and not just his creator. When he took charge after his father's assassination, Macragge and shortly after Ultramar became better than ever before, expanding to become an interstellar empire in its own right. When the Great Crusade and Emperor finally found Guilliman, Guilliman joined the Imperium alongside his domain. Presumably, the Emperor was happy that he'd found a kid who had managed to build something nice for himself and didn't wind up in some kind of hellhole, and also wasn't a nightmare of a person. Ultramar became one of the Imperium's most valuable systems as the homeworld not only a Space Marine legion, but a powerhouse even even beyond that. Eventually expanding to become the 500 worlds it's famously known for, it was even this early on arguably only second in importance to Mars and Terra. As far east into the galaxy as it is, even at this time it was an island of Imperial civilization in an unknown, hostile universe. Come the Horus Heresy, the Battle of Calth, and the Shadow Crusade would put a bit of a damper on Ultramar, it must be said. The Shadow Crusade supposedly obliterated 100 worlds outright as the Word Bearers and World Eaters tore through the place, and then Macragge itself had to contend with Conrad Kurz running around randomly stringing people up by their intestines off of balconies. With hundreds of worlds still under its control, however, recovery wasn't that brutal, speaking relatively of course, and Ultramar prosperity would resume afterwards for the most part. Obviously ignoring planets like Calth, of course, which Lorgar decided would look much better as a glass marble instead of a lush and prosperous world. For a while, Ultramar was also the seat of the Imperium Secundus, the much more direct way that the realm was cosplaying the Byzantine Empire, as Guilliman had no way of knowing if the Emperor or even the rest of the Imperium survived beyond the cut-off realm that he ruled. Since Guilliman didn't know if there was anyone left but him, he figured he might as well form his own little mini-successor empire to try and keep things some level of stable. Eventually this was done away with when Guilliman received news that, yeah, the heresy was still an ongoing thing, but it should be noted that Ultramar damn well likely would have been fine on its own. The book Tempest says that if Guilliman was able to lock it down, dig in, and devote the entirety of the 500 worlds toward the military, even Horus wouldn't be breaking into it. If the Imperium did fall, Guilliman and Ultramar would ensure its foundations didn't go down along with the Emperor. After the heresy, however, Ultramar would be reduced heavily in size, down to just a few dozen worlds. The reason for this was several-fold, but chiefly revolved around Space Marines and Guilliman's edict that they not be lording completely over baseline humans. Plus, with the Codex Astartes breaking up the legions into chapters, there wasn't really a need for a single group of Space Marines to have domain over 500 planets. To be sure, plenty of Ultramarine successor chapters would retain control over former Ultramar planets, and since they worked together closely, it wasn't a total axing of Ultramar's size as much as it was a reorganizing. Kind of like the first time the Eastern and Western Roman empires were split up a bit, a running theme as you'll no doubt notice for this realm. But in terms of direct control, Ultramar was heavily reduced in size, though it was still prosperous. And for the most part, Ultramar would remain prosperous for almost all of the Imperium's history. Trouble would come, to be sure. The War of the Beasts saw several planets come under attack by Orc forces, with the planet Prandium being heavily affected by the Green Tide. Later on again was High Fleet Behemoth, where Prandium this time was just outright devoured. Oops, all Hormagaunts, say goodbye to your garden world. Hansu the Demonculaba guy attacked it once in what was in all honesty a pretty brutal invasion. Then come the 13th Black Crusade, some forces of Abaddons found their way to Ultramar to cause havoc and fail at keeping Guilliman from waking back up. But while that does sound like a lot of problems, consider that that's enough invasions to count on your hands with fingers left over the course of 10,000 years. Compared to other places, that's downright peaceful. I mean, hell, that'd be like if in the history of Earth there had only ever been 4 wars. Guilliman has ever since Awakening ordered that Ultramar be expanded to the former borders it held millennia ago, now with several entire Space Marine chapters dedicated to defending it against intruders. Is this favoritism for his own pet empire, or a wise decision to ensure one of the Imperium's most prosperous regions can continue contributing to the war effort? The answer to that question depends on how much you like Guilliman, which means that this is the entirely correct choice because Guilliman can do no wrong. With the Age of the Dark Imperium beginning, Ultramar found itself attacked by Nurgle's forces and Mortarion himself. It didn't work for the most part, because fighting against the Ultramarines is like putting your head through a wood chipper, but the citizenry were briefly afflicted by various plagues, including a particularly nasty one that could only be cured by Guilliman's presence. Guilliman didn't stick around to play miracle worker here though, because for every Ultramarian he saved, there were about 1 million Imperials dying off-world, half of which at least were because of reasons not inflicted by the Imperium itself. Eventually the Death Guard were repelled, however, and Ultramar once again secured, and it strides forth into the Imperium's future to stand firm against all who would oppose it, and also to safeguard the rest of the Imperium, I guess. As I said, this was the general history of the place, so if you just wanted the most Cliff Notes version possible, you can leave now if you want. For the rest of you, let's get into some more specific lore, shall we? And we might as well start with the heart of it all. The world where it all began, the heart of Ultramar, and if the Imperium goes on as it has been for the last 10,000 years, probably the heart of whatever will be left when Big E finally croaks and takes Terra with him. As said, prior to the Imperium, it kept contact with the rest of its nearby worlds and had its industry intact. In spite of all the nice things I was saying earlier, it is admittedly not the nicest world in the Imperium, climate-wise. It's rather bleak and barren, not a total wasteland like the space between hives on hive worlds, but it's no Midwest where flowing fields of corn make up 90% of the landscape. That being said, in comparison to what a lot of 40k planets have to offer, it's a damn paradise worthy of Ulthuan's snobbiest high elves, and its bleakness is mostly because the planet has a large amount of mountain ranges making it up. It's no doubt picturesque and beautiful, but it tends to be hard for massive civilizations to live in the mountain ranges. Not impossible, because between the dwarfs and the Inca, it can be done, but it's harder. Before Guilliman showed up and kicked everyone into high gear like the giant futuristic Augustus that he is, it was instead ruled by a pair of leader called consuls. You will be understanding that this is just space Rome even more than the Imperium already in large part is. Much like Rome did the ancient Mediterranean, the main governing body on Macragge controlled pretty much the whole planet, although certain key groups were rather keen on achieving independence. Chiefly among them was a group called the Illyrians, who were named after the Illyrians of ancient times that the Romans fought and conquered. GW clearly wasn't trying with that one because they didn't even change a single letter, but they served their background purpose well enough. One of the ruling consuls at the time of Guilliman's arrival was a man named Connor Guilliman. He was a pretty all-around cool dude, and if I had to take a guess, the Julius Caesar to Rebute's Augustus. He wanted to reform Macragge to be far more meritocratic than it was, and taught Guilliman everything he knew about being a pretty solid head of state. Guilliman one day was campaigning against the Illyrians, and during this time, the other consul at the time decided to finalize Connor's status as Caesar by murdering him. When Guilliman returned to find his home burning and his father the victim of an assassination attempt, he was able to rein himself in from slaughtering the traitor and deferred to the Senate for his ultimate fate. They decided to kill him anyways, but this was all done in a by-the-book sort of way, preventing murdering people who wronged you from becoming legal precedent and allowing Guilliman to take his father's place and turn Macragge into the realm that he dreamed of. The government would become a bit less democratic, as much as anyone could call anything that in 40k, as Guilliman would create and take the position of Lord Macragge. As the title suggests, they are the Lord of Macragge, and by extension, the rest of Ultramar. Below that person is the Regent of Ultramar, who in the absence of the Lord Macragge rules in their stead. I am in full transparency unsure on the exact amount of power this person wields if the Lord Macragge is around, but even if it's a purely advisory role, it is the role of the person who advises the head of the most prosperous system in the Imperium. If they advise the Lord Macragge that you need to go, you're going to go, be that go to a battlefield or go to an early grave. Regardless of what it once was, however, in the modern day, the position falls to the captain of the Ultramarines' first company, so in practice at least, by the 41st millennium, the position was one of power rivaled only by actual chapter masters. Macragge has been repeatedly described as one of the better places in the Imperium, as I indeed have done so, but Warhammer being what it is, what that means is not great by our standards. According to the Marnius Calgar comic of all things, Ultramar's prosperity is so great that the average life expectancy prior to things like the Plague Wars and Tyrannic Wars had managed to reach as high as the mid-30s. Is this a certified Black Library moment where the writers have gone off the rails in a stupid way? Is this in the same way that medieval times had the average life expectancy really low, because Macragge families pump out 20 children and the 3 that make it to age 20 can be expected to have a long life? Is this just another sign of how overwhelmingly dogshit all of the Imperium really is, that in the jewel of the Empire you're expected to drop dead by 35? The answer depends on how much of the Imperial Kool-Aid you're drinking, but I choose to believe the secret fourth option of this being Ultramarine slander. The rest of the Imperium no doubt has a life expectancy of like 18 tops, but glorious Ultramar has its citizens reaching the age of 1800 with no issue. As the Horus Heresy was about to start, Macragge was in a damn good position. Ultramar's strength meant that anyone trying to burn their way to it would have to slog through hundreds of worlds, giving the main planet plenty of time to prepare. While the Battle of Calth was utterly devastating for the Ultramarines in the moment, the Legion still remained a potent threat to Horus, and the rest of Ultramar began rebuilding and fortifying, as I said earlier. Macragge headed these efforts and briefly became the capital of the Imperium Secundus. Shortly after that, we then had Conrad Curze running around, while Guilliman, Sanguinius, and the Lion all brooded over what to do and how to proceed. Conrad Curze was able to remain hidden for 2 reasons. One is that he's the evil Batman Primarch, simple as. He was probably doing the thing where someone talks to him without looking at him, only for them to turn and he's gone, albeit in his case he probably stole some of their skin on the way out. The other reason, however, was that Illyria region I mentioned. Even after Guilliman made peace with them, it was still often referred to as Bandit Country, because the Illyrians never really bought into completely joining up with the rest of the planet. To briefly cut ahead, this actually continued on all the way to Guilliman's return in 40k, and in this time period they helped hide Conrad Kurz and even began outright rebelling with him urging them on. This was perhaps not the wisest thing for the Illyrians to do, as the Lion in response told the Dreadwing to do what they do best and start obliterating buildings and ensuring entire regions of the planet would at least temporarily be referred to using the past tense. I have to imagine that some tourism board in the future would make bank over this situation, though. Tour the place where one Primarch tried to off another, only 100 Imperial thrones. At least until officials started telling people there were only ever 9 Primarchs, unless Macragge was immune to that piece of propaganda for a while. Eventually, all the Primarchs piss off and the heresy ends, with Macragge beginning a rebuilding period to make up for the Lion treating buildings Kurz might have been in as target practice. Macragge would then go through a comparative golden age. Things were good because Guilliman was above all things history's best Europa Universalis player. Throughout the entirety of the Imperium's history, Macragge was a haven of progress and prosperity. It wasn't Dark Age tech or anything, not even close, but at least compared to the rest of the Imperium, it didn't plummet from where the Great Crusade was at. It stumbled and tripped a bit, to be sure, but it didn't fall off a cliff like a Looney Tunes character. Its people lived good lives under the stewardship of both the systems Guilliman set up and the Ultramarines. In fact, it really wasn't until M41 that Macragge itself was ever properly threatened. Ultramar faced problems, but Macragge itself was by and large fine until the consequences of Barabbas Dantioch smashing a lantern became apparent. High Fleet Behemoth was the first sign that, at least in my opinion, the factions of 40k have a time limit unless they get their shit together, and it showed that by bulldozing straight into the realm of Ultramar and devouring a good chunk of it. More on that shortly, since that's Ultramar as a whole, but for Macragge itself I have to assume this was terrifying for its citizens, soldiers, and of course the Ultramarines themselves, at least on some level. For 10,000 years this beacon of Imperial civilization stood strong and largely safe from outside threats. Chaos, Xenos, and pretty much everyone that wasn't the occasional Illyrian serial killer or something like that were essentially non-issues. And then the hungry bugs from beyond the galactic rim decided that Ultramar was a damn tasty looking snack and they'd like a bite. Well, I haven't mentioned it yet, Macragge actually had a substantial amount of orbital defenses in addition to the ground forces. It certainly wasn't a fortress turbo military planet like Cadia or Reach, but the stations and fleet it had was nothing to sneeze at. The Tyranids bowled straight through the orbital defenses on their way to the ground, and despite them giving their best, spaceborne assets were almost to a man devoured by Behemoth. It was only the combination of a fleet of over 200 ships jumping in to save the planet, as well as an Emperor-class battleship blowing itself up in the middle of the Tyranids' fleet that saved the day. As for on the ground during the invasion, Ultramar was now about 95% Tyranid as far as population demographics go, and was doing about as well as that sounds. Entire regions of the planet were slain, be it by Genestealer sabotage or just the unrelenting tide of monsters the planet was drowning under. Almost all of the Ultramarines' auxiliary forces, because remember, Space Marines do sometimes have quite the amount of underling mortal followers, were devoured. Macragge's PDF might as well have been a thing of the past after this. Marneus Calgar himself was defeated in combat by the Swarmlord, and only survived because his honor guard kept essentially feeding themselves to the thing until he could be evacuated. The polar fortresses became some of the only remaining holdouts, and in the northern fortress, the entire First Company was wiped out, rendering not only collective centuries of experience, but dozens of suits of Terminator armor now null and void. Most of the aftermath of this attack focuses on the Ultramarines themselves, but we do know it took them centuries to recover and had to go to the Blood Angels for massive amounts of support for decades just to survive. I imagine the planet itself also took at least a few decades to recover, though ultimately it did recover, as the last of the Tyranids were wiped from Macragge's surface. The Black Legion would be the next to attack Macragge, and this one strikes me as significantly less impactful than the Tyranids. It was, to be fair, much less of a proper invasion of one of the Imperium's finest worlds, and more of a panic response. Abaddon was sipping some of his homemade craft beer, he makes that by the way, I swear to God, and was given news that a Primarch was going to be resurrected. Presumably after shitting his pants upon realizing Guilliman is the worst possible loyalist to come back, he threw a bunch of people at Macragge to try and stop it. They failed, but I'm sure the collateral damage of the goddamn Black Legion invading the planet was the stuff of nightmares. The Plague Wars would follow shortly thereafter, and this one was even lower in scale, albeit for understandable reasons. On Macragge itself anyways, they were miserable in the outlying worlds. The Plague Wars were much more of a proper invasion than Abaddon desperately trying to ensure Guilliman's nap wasn't interrupted and the Tyranids chomping through Space Marines respectively. Nurgle's forces were doing themselves a nice and proper invasion to subsume as much of Ultramar into his sweaty folds as possible. Macragge itself was for the most part spared, although there were several instances of cultist activity, raids from small forces, and Illyrian uprises to destabilize the region. Funny enough, all these instances seemed to do was strengthen Macragge itself, as Marneus Calgar swept them aside, and all he took away from it was that the rebellions from the PDF were so shit that their training clearly had slacked. He basically told them to get their shit together, because if they rebelled so pathetically, then their training was clearly subpar, which is one of the most audacious things I've ever heard of in 40k. This man's subordinates rebelled against his realm, and all he had to say on the matter was how crap they were. What a guy, that Calgar. Macragge itself does have a few notable regions to its name that are worth at least mentioning. Its capital is known as Magna Macragge Civitas in GW speak, also known as Macragge City if you're the kind of person who thought the Halo TV show was good. While not too much is described about it, it is called one of, if not the greatest city in the entire Eastern Imperium, so we can safely assume it's absolutely beautiful to behold and generally flourishes. The Ultramarines, being the cool dudes they are, occasionally intermingle with the normal humans of the planet as well, so if you're grabbing a quick bite to eat, the guy on the table over may damn well be one of the Emperor's angels. The Hera's Crown Mountains are the largest range of mountains on the planet, rising far into the sky and providing the sort of majestic visage that would make anyone pause at the beauty of it all. I presume there's also the same waypoints on these summits as there are for us on Mount Everest, that is to say, brightly dressed corpses of people who didn't quite make the peak. Maybe that's how the Ultramarines used failed aspirants. Cold Steel Ridge is described as an industrial area, certainly no Forge World plant, but it does no doubt supply the Ultramarines and their auxiliaries with valuable arms. Most importantly, however, this is where Marneus Calgar cosplayed as the Black Knight from Monty Python when he engaged the Swarm Lord. The Tyranids overtook the entire area during the invasion, and after that I'm not entirely sure what happened. Maybe it was repopulated and the forges lit again, maybe it was turned into a shrine for the fallen, or maybe it was just left to rot as more pressing matters kept taking hold. The polar fortresses are just that, massive fortresses at the north and south poles for the Ultramarines to rally at and conduct defensive operations as needed. Naturally, this too was most shown during the defense of Macragge against High Fleet Behemoth, where they held the line for as long as possible during the horrendous fighting that occurred. Illyria is, as I said, bandit country, located in the more northern areas of Macragge. It doesn't actually rebel all that much throughout history, with rebellious sentiments only really cropping back up during the Plague Wars. Bandits and thieves, sure, but proper rebellion did mostly stop after a while. There's a sea called the Aenean Sea, because ancient Greece stuff is second only to ancient Rome stuff on this planet, and of course, the Valley of Laponis needs to be mentioned. When Guilliman arrived, it was basically just a small little ravine in the side of a mountain, before it became one of the most important regions in the entire Imperium. The reason for that is simple. Does this need to be its own transition segment? Not really, no, but I feel that you are in danger of not being patriotic enough for the greatest of them all. I really need you to understand the gravity of this place and what it means for the galaxy. So without further ado, the Fortress of Hera is where decisions that affect the entire galaxy are made, without hyperbole. It is the fortress monastery of the Ultramarines, the seat of their power where they dictate policy for Macragge, Ultramar as a whole, and quite frankly probably most of the important things in Segmentum Ultima. This is where one of the greatest seats of power lies within the entire Imperium, and it is equal parts monastic fortress, government building, and artistic masterpiece. It is here that the Ultramarines themselves call home, where they base their operations out of, and where the enemies of the Imperium can find their future doom being planned by the Sons of Guilliman. Within it are some of the holiest arms, armor, and countless different blessed relics from ages long past that the Ultramarines use to meticulously plan out their campaigns and more. In this building, history is written and destiny is made. Within this hallowed building can be found such places as the Temple of Correction, a shrine with enough valuable materials in its construction to arm an entire crusade fleet. Within it can be found the Shrine of Guilliman, where for 10,000 years the Primarch's body lay and pilgrims paid him visit all the while. Though he has since recovered, it is no doubt still one of the most revered sites in the Imperium. Other highlights are the Library of Ptolemy, one of the greatest libraries in the entire Imperium, and Galen's Rock, where the Ultramarines execute those of their own kin who have committed a crime where no other punishment suffices. In the Fortress of Hera, the Imperium itself marches forward. Pardon me, the spirit of the Ultramarines overtook me there for a bit. Anyways, let's look at the rest of Ultramar now, shall we? Ultramar itself is anywhere from a handful of worlds to over 500, depending on the period, and is ruled by the same government as exists on Macragge. And while I've said the system has rarely seen too many invasions, the rest of it has certainly seen more action than Macragge itself. Guilliman was diplomatic in annexing most of what would become Ultramar, so early on, aside from the Age of Strife, it was fine. Come the Horus Heresy and Lorgar and Angron burning through 100 worlds, that's the kind of thing that leaves a dent in the GDP, if nothing else. Assuming my math skills aren't even worse than I thought they were, 100 out of 500 worlds is an entire fifth of Ultramar razed to the ground. Even for a system as prosperous as it, I would wager that it likely took centuries to recover from, and some planets never did. The planet of Kalth was once a beautiful, lush paradise of a world. It was considered one of the highlights of Ultramar, but in addition to that, it also had vast underground arcologies and orbital shipyards that could service the entirety of the Ultramarines when they were the largest legion around. Then Lorgar did a funny and betrayed the Ultramarines at Kalth, wiping out a third of the legion and turning the planet into a marble. 100 planets followed, and while for brevity I won't stay on this too long, keep in mind that this was multiple legions of Space Marines going at it. Especially once the World Eaters and Angron got involved, this was Guilliman and his realm facing off against Chaos's strongest believers and Khorne's strongest Crayon Eaters. The fighting only really ended when Guilliman decided to sail to Terra to try and break the siege upon realizing the Terra still in fact existed. Ironically enough, however, while Kalth itself never recovered, its usefulness arguably only increased. The entire atmosphere was blown away, which made servicing ships easier, turning it into the premier shipyard for Ultramar. The underground arcologies, meanwhile, were expanded further than ever before, so plenty of people could still live here, including some Space Marine aspirants. Even when Ultramar is blown to bits, it only comes back stronger. Originally, the entire Ultramar mini-empire was ruled in addition to the Lord Macragge by 4 officials known as Tetrarchs. Did you know that ancient Rome was once ruled by 4 emperors, 2 juniors and 2 senior ones? Did you know this was called Tetrarchy? Are you firmly grasping the concept of Space Rome by this point in the video? As Guilliman essentially cut Ultramar into a fraction of what it once was, this post was abolished, as there was no longer a need for 4 entire junior co-rulers to govern the handful of planets left to Macragge. Come Guilliman's return, however, this independence was itself dissolved and the positions re-established. There's actually been a decent amount of resistance to this and the occasional bit of mini-civil warring over planets being subsumed back into Ultramar. From my understanding of it, these worlds aren't outright rebelling against the Imperium, but rather it's more of a feudal lord kind of infighting deal. Like something that might come out of a Crusader Kings game, where your son assassinates your other son because he wants to marry your daughter who you already married off to the second son. No high treason against the overall government, but infighting over who gets to be subservient only to the guy in charge and who has to be the lieutenant to the lieutenant. Tetrarchs of course come from the Ultramarines and their successor chapters because legion building is back in style if you aren't too obvious about it, and they actually answer only to Guilliman and indeed outrank the chapter master, at least in governmental duties. Although with Marneus Calgar ruling over Macragge, which in turn has the most power in the system, how true that is probably up for debate, and how treasonous a given Tetrarch may be feeling at the moment's notice. In modern day, they have their own dedicated honor guard, and they help things run smoothly as the 500 worlds no doubt need quite the amount of paperwork to help keep them chugging along. As I believe I mentioned earlier, plenty of the worlds are resisting being brought back into the fold, but it would appear that the once again Captain Titus is on the case of making everyone get in line and behave once more. Titus thinks it's an impossible task, and I gotta be honest, he might be right on doubting Guilliman about being able to do it, but it's better to have impossible goals than no goals, I suppose. That does also make me wonder if some of those worlds Guilliman diplomatically annexed were done via gunboat diplomacy. I imagine that I too would be willing to join the Imperium if I saw behind the messenger a few warlord titans and some battleships hanging in the sky. Not that Guilliman would ever use such barbaric force, of course. No. He has no need to do so, because of the implication. In addition to all that, it is worth briefly mentioning that there's also the Shield chapters of Ultramar, 10 Space Marine chapters whose entire job is to make sure that the realm stays safe. So apparently I was wrong earlier, and being quiet about legion building isn't necessary at all. Just go ahead. The actual appointment of the Tetrarchs revolves around one of the 4 main planets of Ultramar beyond Macragge. Each of these worlds leads one of the other 4 sectors of the realm, north, south, east, and west. The northern sector is based around the planet of Connor, a forge world named after Guilliman's adoptive father that no doubt provides a vast amount of the equipment Ultramar and the Eastern Imperium at large require. The southern sector is based around the world of Angron, of which I could find fuck all information about beyond the fact the ruling Tetrarch comes from the Genesis chapter. You already know that guy was probably coming as close as Space Marines physically can to blowing his load when he got that appointment. The eastern sector is based off the planet of Espetor, once ruled by another entity that I'm not even going to bother remembering the name of because its lore pretty much consists of, and then High Fleet Kraken ate everyone in it. It got subsumed back into Ultramar with fairly minimal fanfare after that, likely because being independent is all well and good, but having someone to help feed your people after the Tyranids ate half of them is better. And the western sector is ruled from the planet of Protoss. Once again, I've nothing much to report to you beyond the fact that it exists. To be fair though, not all of these places need much in the way of development, as snarky as I might have sounded. Ultramar has a lot of systems and planets of all types making it up, and we don't really need an in-depth look on Forge World number 12. I can safely assume it's the same as the rest of them, just with more blue paint thrown around. I will say though that the various types of planets might go a long way in explaining why Ultramar having a life expectancy of 30 is such a big deal. If you take it to mean the entire realm as a whole rather than just Macragge, it makes perfect sense when you look at what that actually means. Even within the same system as Macragge is the planet of Thulium, a death world. Once you include things like Forge Worlds where OSHA violations are the norm, it makes sense that the average life expectancy is only 30. On Macragge and some of the other civilized worlds, things are great, no problems at all, and everyone lives decent lives. 5 feet to the left, galactically speaking, is the Hell World, where the atmosphere is made out of bromine and the animals are the size of Imperial Knights and subsist off a diet of human blood. Plus, plenty of threats are left over from the various invasions that have occurred, especially in recent years. Old One-Eye was stalking around Calth for a while, likely causing entire towns to just vanish off the face of the map every now and again. Macragge itself may be a jewel, but to say it's a diamond in the rough is an understatement. Even if you want to be as nice as possible about the state of affairs, a lot of these planets having not been a part of Ultramar for millennia means they lack the guidance of the greatest of them all, ensuring their backward slide into primitive barbarism without the spiritual lieges of the Space Marines to guide them. No, the Ultramarine propaganda will not stop. I am Matt Ward's strongest soldier. Saying something is a threat to the Ultramarines is rather laughable, since none can hope to stand against them, but the region does have a long history of invasions that's worth going over again at least a little bit. The Horus Heresy doesn't bear too much mention, truth be told, as far as the Shadow Crusade goes, because it really wasn't all that significant, and I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. For as much as Angron did become a demon prince, and as much as the Ruin Storm was probably the greatest warp storm since the one that caused the Age of Strife, the entire thing could be boiled down to one massive delaying action to keep the Smurfs from Terra. Now, as I said, this was a delaying action that burned 100 planets to cinders and ashes, and the Night Lords even got in on the action themselves by a little bit of fighting against Loyalist Iron Warriors, which is an event we'll come back to shortly. But the goal was never to take down Ultramar. Make it bleed, kill as many Ultramarines as possible, and make Guilliman's life hell, but Horus knew that even the combined Word Bearers and World Eaters couldn't take the Blueberries and their empire down. They did force it to become the Imperium Secundus and essentially isolate itself from the galaxy for a while, which does by all accounts mean the Ruin Storm and Shadow Crusade were for a time wildly successful, however. When the largest legion and one of the best Primarchs to fight against Horus was forced to go home and play Civ 5 for a while, you've done your job damn well. Afterwards, additional threats were few and far between, but as is the running theme of 40k, things only got worse over time. Those Night Lords, funnily enough, may have doomed Ultramar and the entire galaxy in the long run, because when they were attacking, the focus of the battle was the Pharaohs, a mini Necron Astronomicon. Barabas Antioch, whose name I always accidentally say is Barabbas because I am dumb, sacrificed himself to blow it up. A nice, simple, heroic event that caused a massive flash in the warp and drew the Tyranids towards the Milky Way as they realized that something of that caliber can only come from life existing in the galaxy. High Fleet Behemoth was the first to invade, and while I wouldn't say it's a glossed-over event, it is something that I, at least, think deserves a bit more prominence beyond it being relegated to just the first wave of Tyranids in preparation for the bigger ones. The planet of Prondium was once a jewel even by Ultramar standards. A lush, verdant garden world, it was the kind of place even Eldar Exodites would find appealing. For some reason, this planet was chosen to be the location of a mock battle between two Ultramarine forces, and while the testing gave them some good knowledge, it also heavily scarred the planet. At least personally, I wouldn't choose the Hanging Gardens of Babylon to be where I test out battle tactics, but the planet did recover back to its former self and was even turned into at least partially an agri-world. Then the Beast forces came knocking, but at least by the 41st millennium, things were good again. Orcs may release spores across the planet, but they usually don't intentionally strip a world bare of life. It just kind of happens as they plop ramshackle dwellings, factories, and bombs everywhere. And then, High Fleet Behemoth rolled in. Marneus Calgar himself led the defense of the world, and for his trouble, a large amount of Space Marines were killed and the planet devoured so entirely that even its atmosphere is gone today. Vast swaths of Ultramar were devoured alongside it, and the shame of losing this fight in particular has never quite left the Ultramarines. In what is unfortunately a now discontinued model line, the Ultramarines created an entire sect of warriors called the Tyrannic War Veterans, solely to focus on fighting the bugs as a response to the hardship this invasion caused. It was so traumatic that Marneus Calgar declared the Ultramarines had become blind, adhering to the Codex Astartes as dogma when it should be nothing more than a very well-constructed guidebook for the situations Guilliman was able to conceive 10,000 years prior. The First Tyrannic War shuffled off thousands of years of corruption, degradation, and more because of how horrific it was, and I would say it only stopped at just causing that much of a shakeup because it didn't occur somewhere worse equipped to handle it. The aftermath in terms of material losses was no better. Beyond outlying planets, entire regions of Macragge were left temporarily barren, and the premier chapter of the Imperium was forced to call on the Blood Angels for aid just to deal with the few remaining Tyranids scuttling across the planet. It took decades for them to recover, and keep in mind the Genesis chapter's entire existence can be boiled down to acting as a reserve force the Ultramarines can draw from to replace losses. They have an entire backup chapter, and the losses were so great they couldn't even make up for them with that. And they didn't even totally destroy Behemoth, because Tyranid sub-factions are just different hive fleets. Splinters of Behemoth would survive to continue plaguing the galaxy to this day. Hive Fleet Kraken also caused problems, although this was admittedly a lesser incident because half the Hive Fleet instead decided they wanted to devour Craftworld Iandin instead. Still bad, but the Ultramarines had some unplanned help from the Blue and Yellow Eldar to mitigate the damage, so if nothing else the entire invasion just proves that if your main colors in Warhammer are blue and yellow, you can survive anything and are probably smarter and cooler and more handsome than everyone else. It should be noted however that the planet Sotha was completely devoured by Kraken, much like Prondium was by Behemoth, because Barabbas Antioch died doing some heroic stuff, and in 40k there's basically no good deed that goes unpunished. It should also be noted that Sotha was once a cardinal world, which means it was ruled by the Ecclesiarchy. A planet named Sotha ruled by priests, you say? The Tribunal thinks they can pull a fast one on us like that, trying to bring that Alm-CV nonsense over to our good and proper 40k religion. The Plague Wars are the most recent catastrophe, as Nurgle decided that having some real estate in reality was a good idea. The entire thing can be summed up fairly nicely, as the Death Guard and demons physically attacking Ultramar, while the general aura of anything related to Nurgle caused countless diseases to spring up across the realm. The region was blindsided with the attacks in many ways, as they occurred while the Indominus Crusade was still tearing ass to try and mitigate the Great Rift, and it got to a point that even Connor, the Forge World that is in the Macragge system, was invaded by the Death Guard. The attacks were repulsed as Guilliman and Ultramarine successors arrived, and as you likely know, the Emperor himself possessed Guilliman's corpse, told Mortarion he's a bit of a shitter but could be redeemed, and then pissed Golden Fire on Nurgle's garden for good measure. But despite that, the end result is still that the Ultramarines now have to contest with several systems in real space known as the Scourge Stars, infested with Death Guard right to their galactic northern border. This is not only problematic for the Ultramarines, but the Imperium as a whole. Propaganda aside for a moment, Ultramar has repeatedly been described as a jewel of the Imperium. I'm not just showing favoritism to the Max, that's how it is, even if it's that only because GW is also showing they have a favorite child. All of humanity has regressed technologically and in a whole lot of other ways, but Ultramar has suffered from this the least. And out of everyone to be aware of this fact, you can be damn certain Chaos and the traitor Primarchs especially know it. What this has done is given Chaos, Nurgle in particular, a foothold to destroy one of the only remaining bastions of knowledge and things not being completely shit that the Imperium has. Ultramar going down means more than just the physical loss such an event would entail. It would likely be the start of the Imperium's total decline. Already a rotting corpse of an empire, this would expedite the process immensely. By sheer volume of how prevalent these threats are, there's also no doubt at least a few orc planets in Necron Tomb worlds somewhere within Ultramar. Galactically speaking, 500 worlds isn't too many, but they occupy a decent enough chunk of space, and no doubt somewhere within these borders there's some variation of green Xenos waiting to jump Ultramar once they get the chance. I bet there's even a tomb world on at least a few Ultramar-occupied planets, for that matter. Off the top of my head, I'm afraid I don't know if there's any confirmed ones, but mathematically speaking, there's gotta be at least 1 or 2 worlds out of the 500 that have some sleepy metal skeletons beneath the surface. I'd say the greatest threat, at least in abstract terms, is the Tau Empire. Now please stop laughing or getting ready to call me slurs and allow me to explain. The Tau Empire isn't by itself necessarily the greatest threat. Nurgle tried to invade Ultramar itself and it failed. The Tau would no doubt run into a similar wall of bullets and Astartes and get sent packing. but consider what their existence represents. The Tau Empire is practically touching Ultramar. In the most practical terms, this means that this is a region of space where the Tau, who need I remind you, are just about the only faction in 40k that isn't suffering from things like technological degradation or entire planets being lost to bureaucracy, to ferry troops and supplies straight to any theoretical front line. A war between the Tau and the Ultramarines is about the only conflict the Tau can have with another faction, where their slower FTL speed doesn't mean that much because the two realms are touching tips. Worse, however, is what this all represents. The Imperium doesn't like Xenos. They would gladly see even the most peaceful ones glassed because they're unholy creatures, as per dogma, and any instances of them working together are because the Imperium is facing another more pressing threat, or at least doesn't want to add on to existing ones. The Tau are a Xenos empire on the fringe of their most prosperous and arguably most powerful single realm within the Imperium. Other Forge Worlds like Mars are more productive than Connor, I'm sure, and if you did something like take the entirety of Segmentum Solar's fleet, it'd far outclass Ultramar's own. But as an entity, a realm within the Imperium, Ultramar is the most well-equipped and whatnot in the entire thing without cheating and comparing them to the entirety of the Adeptus Mechanicus or something like that. And with all that might behind it, with the backing of one of the original 20 Astartes legions and all their successor chapters, the Imperium still can't keep powerful Xeno species from arising on one of their core areas' front lawn. In terms of threats, the Tau certainly aren't the greatest, even if they're more potent than a lot of people give them credit for. No, their threat is more in what they represent. The fact that the Imperium can't manage to keep even minor Xeno species from rising to prominence nowadays, no matter if they're in the fringes of space or one of their most powerful subrealms. Barbarians at the gates aren't just a problem because they're at your gates. It's a problem because that means all the walls you have couldn't keep them from getting to the gates. But on that note, Ultramar itself will likely endure. Horus said that it could endure the heresy if Guilliman so chose to become independent, and even after 10,000 years of humanity getting worse and worse as the threats grow greater and greater, it has remained a shining beacon of the setting. In the same way that all other Space Marine chapters weep because they will never be Ultramarines, so too does the rest of Imperial Space lament that it will never be as great as glorious Ultramar. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Ultramar to my Imperium, a shining beacon to guide the way for everyone in your wake. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. This is only tangentially related to the video, but I don't think Angron chewing out Guilliman and the heresy for not knowing true courage and honor is as cool and valid as you might think. He had some points because, yeah, compared to himself, Guilliman might as well have grown up in the Garden of Eden. But saying Guilliman knows nothing about courage and honor is just wrong. The entire speech takes place as Guilliman is fighting against the Primarch most known for turning anything in arm's reach into meat paste, which is pretty courageous, I'd argue. And Guilliman not only held himself from personally executing his father's killer out of vengeance to ensure his political system is stable, but tends to keep to his word and not randomly glass planets that bother him, which I'd say is pretty honorable, at least by 40k standards. To be clear, I don't think this is bad writing, and Guilliman responds by calling Angron a slave, so he gets his own diss in. And I think it's pretty clear that this incident wasn't being used as an author's mouthpiece to diss Grandpa Smurf. This was a character interaction, one between a man who grew up in the worst way possible and one who comparatively was able to comfortably grow and adjust to the world. Nothing said by Angron is unreasonable to be said, given who he is. A rabid animal judging you for not having rabies isn't really the benchmark for philosophical opinions and judgments of character, you know?